مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. منعت حركة طالبان الثلاثاء الماضي الفتيات من الالتحاق بالجامعات في أفغانستان. يأتي هذا الحظر بعد أسابيع من حظر طالبان دخول النساء إلى الحدائق العامة وصالات الرياضة. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف تنضم إلينا الدكتورة بحر جلالي، مؤسسة أول برنامج دراسات للنوع الاجتماعي في أفغانستان. دكتورة بحر، شكرا لانضمامك إلينا.
Thank you.
طالبان أوقفت التعليم الجامعي لجميع الطالبات في أفغانستان، لكن لماذا الآن بعد 17 شهرا من الحكم؟
Well, it's very much in line with the Taliban ideology. There has been a lot of propaganda, a lot of lobbying by many people in the West and other places that the Taliban 2.0 have changed. But like so many Afghan women, like myself, I've been warning the world the Taliban have not changed. They are who they are. So banning women from university education is part of who they are. And that should not come as a surprise to anyone.
هل هي مناورة للتأثير على الغرب بعد شعور طالبان أن سياسة المهادنة لم تؤتي ثمارها؟ هل ملف النساء هو آخر ورقة لطالبان للضغط على الغرب؟
Yes, obviously the Taliban have been normalized to a significant extent. They have been legitimized by many actors in the West. And in many ways, they have received soft recognition, being invited to high-profile gatherings. So I think they do expect to be recognized as the official government of Afghanistan. But it's obvious that they have not been performing like a normal government in any sense of the world. And so it's possible that they are resorting to these extreme measures to say, well, if you don't recognize us, we're going to make things much worse in Afghanistan. But I think that that strategy will backfire, and it's going to make them appear to be even more impossible to recognize. So the strategy they're putting forth is only going to backfire. I think it's not going to get people to say, okay, well, let's recognize them before they do more damage.
وزير الخارجية الأمريكي حذر من العواقب ردا على تحرك طالبان الأخير لإلغاء حريات المرأة. ما الذي يمكن أن تفعله الولايات المتحدة؟
Well, I think the first and foremost is that it's obvious that the policy of appeasement has failed, and that needs to be clearly recognized. Second, we need to see some women leaders at least making verbal condemnations about this. Not a single woman head of state, a sports figure, celebrity, business leader, politician has even made a simple verbal condemnation. So that needs to happen. As for the US and the international community, who have been saying we need to engage with the Taliban because it's necessary to rebuild Afghanistan, well, I think they need to realize that the Taliban are not a reliable partner, and those are, of course, borne out by their actions, by their inability to serve the Afghan people, and they're ultimately a proxy force. So I don't know how long it's going to take for that to happen. Also, the U.S. and other countries need to start working and talking to other Afghan groups and not act like the Taliban are the only option. So that needs to happen as well.
باعتقادك لماذا تتجاهل طالبان مخاطر قراراتها التي تحد من حرية المرأة وآثار هذه القرارات السلبية على الاقتصاد في البلاد؟
Well, I think it's important to understand that they feel very confident because they have been empowered tremendously ever since the Doha deal that was signed in 2020. So they have been in the past few years legitimized, normalized, emboldened, empowered by so many different actors. I mean, Norway was sending them private jets, so they feel that they can get away with it, and they can throw their weight around, and they can use this as leverage to get other countries to say, well, something, we have to deal with them, and unless we recognize them, they might, there's no telling, they're going to do stuff like this. So I think they feel very, very confident, and so maybe even overconfident that they're resorting to these measures, because we have seen when they banned teenage girls from going to school, nothing happened. Nobody did anything except for a few verbal condemnations. So they know that they can get away with it. And this time, we need to see much more than just simple verbal condemnations by some human rights organizations. We need to see the travel bans being reinstated. There needs to be either tangible pressure on the Taliban or, looking at, alternative actors in Afghanistan.
بحديثك عن منظمة هيومن رايتس ووتش التي انتقدت الحظر ووصفته بأنه قرار مخجل ينتهك حق النساء والفتيات، هل من الممكن أن تقدم هذه المنظمات الحقوقية ما هو أكبر من التنديد والشجب؟
They can, but they can't do it by themselves, right? We need to see people like Ursula von der Leyen. We need to see Hillary Clinton. We need to see Jacinda Ardern. We need to see Sana Moran or Kamala Harris, all these women leaders making condemnations. I think that will be very impactful. That's going to corner the Taliban, but we're seeing none of it, right? I expect to see condemnations from Human Rights Watch, but we need to see it from other actors, and we're not seeing it. And and that's what's empowering the Taliban. Okay, we're going to do all these things and we're going to get away with it and nobody's going to say anything. The world is going to be silent. And that's been the case. And that's what's, making them feel that they can do all of these things.
لأشرح أكثر، ما عنيته بسؤالي مثلا أن تتيح دروسا على الإنترنت كبديل للجامعات والمدارس المغلقة، هذا إن وصلت الفتيات إلى الإنترنت في هذا البلد الفقير.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about online education and getting different universities and institutions to provide online education. But I think it's important to understand that online education can never be an alternative to institutionalized education on the ground. Internet access is a luxury for many families in Afghanistan. It's not realistic. Even when I was working at the American University, the bandwidth was very, very weak and poor. So that's really not a viable alternative for most Afghan women. And even if it was a very viable alternative, it cannot replace a system of formal education within the country. And that's what that's. I mean, it can be an emergency alternative, but nothing long term or permanent. But other organizations can provide more scholarships to Afghan women, so they're not deprived of an education. Helping increasing the number of scholarships for Afghan women, and in the meantime, putting pressure on the Taliban. So that's what I see, but I don't see online education as a very viable alternative for many people.
هل مغادرة البلاد هي الخيار الوحيد للأفغانيات اللائي يرغبن بمواصلة التعليم؟ وهل ستكون أمورهم ميسرة إن عزموا على ذلك؟
Well, unfortunately, yes, it has become the only alternative. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is I taught the best and brightest students in my 8.5 years in Afghanistan. And now none of them are in Afghanistan anymore. They're all in the United States or Europe or Canada and Australia. I'm like, look, we trained a whole new generation to lead Afghanistan into the next decade, and now they're all gone. So it's not that they don't want to stay in their country, but the Taliban and the international community that's been very much normalizing the Taliban has made it impossible for them to remain in their country and have any kind of normal life. So anybody who can leave is leaving, and it's because they've been forced to.
ما هي الأطراف الدولية التي يمكن أن تضغط على طالبان للعدول عن بعض قراراتها التي تستهدف المرأة؟ هل من حلول لهذه المعضلة؟
Well, the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and the list can go on. Regional countries, right? Regional countries like Turkey, right? A big regional power, putting pressure on Pakistan, right? So, I mean, basically, so many different actors, the whole world needs to get involved, and we're seeing relative silence. So I think the very first step is that the international community needs to put a lot of pressure on the Taliban to understand that there's not only are these types of measures not going to help them get recognition, but it's going to make it further and further impossible for them to get recognition. Reinstate the travel bans on those Taliban. Why is Anas Akhani, a well-known terrorist, being invited to these high-profile meetings? And I've been saying this for months. The way the international community is behaving with the Taliban is very much like they're giving them soft recognition. So it should come as no surprise. So we need UN condemnations. We need United States. We need Joe Biden to say something, Kamala Harris, and also restricting travel for the Taliban, and putting, restricting aid, and really cornering them and isolating them. And that's really, instead of, all of these think tanks in Washington, D.C. are publishing reports saying we must engage with the Taliban in order to rebuild Afghanistan. How can you rebuild a country when the entity you want to engage with is destroying it and not rebuilding it? So I do believe that there are people who are profiting from lobbying for the Taliban, and there needs to be, all of these international organizations have to collectively state that this is unacceptable. You will never be recognized unless you function like a normal government. I mean, it's very plain and simple. And also international NGOs, and meanwhile, while this is all happening, have to increase aid and increase scholarship. So a whole generation of Afghan women stand to become uneducated. So those are some emergency measures that need to be put in place. Soros Foundation, other foundations, major universities in the world have to establish some sort of special plan to give scholarships to Afghan women, especially those women who are about to graduate and now are not going to graduate. So they've lost all of those years that they've been studying is going to be for nothing. So those women especially need to be prioritized so they can at least graduate and get their degree. So all those years that they studied is not going to, just be for nothing. So Afghanistan needs a lot of help from multiple actors, but unfortunately we're seeing the world doesn't really care.
دكتورة بحر جلالي، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to join you.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.